Hello, my name's Cliff Stevenson and I'm the Helpful Economist. Today we're looking at whether the junior doctor's pay claim of 35% is unreasonable. The doctors have come in for a lot of criticism from government, being labelled militant and the pay claim being called unrealistic, and the government haven't even been willing to open discussions with this claim on the table. At first, 35% does sound massive, much higher than the current level of inflation. So let's take a closer look at how this figure was calculated. The first thing to say is that the BMA emphasised that this isn't a claim for a pay increase. It's merely a claim that pay is restored to the 2008 level, taking into account inflation, using an index and setting 2008 to 100. They show how inflation has increased to 158.1, an increase of 58.1%. The blue line shows the actual increases in junior doctors' pay, and this has increased by only 16.9% over the same period. On the basis of the indices, the difference between the two is 41.2, and we can express this as a percentage of the 116.9, and that gives us 35%, i.e. junior doctors' pay needs to increase by 35% in order to be the same as it was in 2008, taking into account inflation. So what we can say is that there is a very reasonable logic to this calculation, and it's a bit dishonest of the government to be so critical of it. Now let me just say that I do think the junior doctors have a very strong claim for a significant pay increase. However, my job as an economist is always to interrogate the statistics, and I do think that there are some questions that need to be looked at here. So the government produces three main measures of inflation: the retail price index, the consumer price index, and the CPIH index, which is the same as the CPI index but also takes into account housing costs. And these different indices show different levels of inflation for this period. So the BMA uses the RPI to claim that doctors' pay should be increased by 35%, but the same calculation using the CPI would give a figure of 28%, and the CPIH would suggest that doctors' pay needs to increase by 19%. So we can see it makes a massive difference which inflation index is used. Of course, it's quite complex to identify the key differences between these different measures, but we can make a few quick observations in comparing them. Although the RPI is still calculated, it's no longer an official measure of inflation, and it's considered as not meeting the required standard in order to be an official statistic. The CPI is used by the government in setting its inflation targets, but the Office for National Statistics has said that the CPIH is the lead inflation index. Remember that the calculation using the CPIH gives us a pay increase of 19%. So have the BMA been dishonest in using the RPI? Well, not necessarily. The main difference between the RPI and CPI is in terms of the averaging formula used. The calculation method is different, and in terms of the representativeness of the population and the goods and services covered by the index. And of course there can be some debate about which one is more accurate. However, there is a reason why the RPI is still used, and the ONS points out that the reason why the RPI is still produced is because businesses still use it in long-term contracts. It's not the case in all situations, but there clearly are cases where the RPI is used for things like rail fares, mobile phone charges and energy bills. So I think we can say that it's not straightforward in deciding which index is more appropriate. I do think there's another very important point to be made here, that there are issues about working conditions and staff morale and what we expect junior doctors to do. After all, junior doctors account for 45% of the medical workforce. The General Medical Council conducts an annual survey of trainee doctors, and in its most recent report they said that burnout is now at the highest level since they started tracking it in 2018, and a recent survey of junior doctors by the BMA found that 40% of junior doctors will leave the NHS as soon as they can find another job, and the NHS produces statistics on the reasons why people leave. So a decade ago voluntary resignations accounted for 38.4%, but they've now increased massively to 61.7%. This does cover all staff and not just doctors, But it is indicative of what's happening in the NHS. This isn't supposed to be a definitive analysis, but I think it's safe to say that staff morale is at an all-time low, and that pay restoration is important both in terms of the current staff morale, but also in terms of improving the situation by attracting new doctors into the NHS. Overall, I do think the junior doctors have a very good case to restore their pay to the 2008 level. However, there is room for debate on which inflation measures should be used. I do think there is a case for at least considering how the other measures could be used. And it's fair to point out that this is the BMA's starting point in the negotiations. Perhaps the other indices do give some room for negotiation, so it would be good if the government did come to the table. One issue that does need to be considered is that the UK currently has a significant debt problem, and the government would have to find the money to finance such a big pay increase. However, although this is a reality that clearly needs to be taken into account, it also doesn't justify the extent to which junior doctors' pay has been cut so drastically in real terms. I do think the claims of the junior doctors are legitimate in economic terms, and the answer surely has to be getting round the negotiating table and thrashing this out. We could also just point out that no one questions companies raising their prices in response to inflation to cover the effects of inflation on their costs and profitability. See my recent video on greedflation for more on this. This clearly doesn't have an easy answer, but the type of pay offer being discussed with the nurses, i.e. a cash payment plus 5%, is very far from restoration. I hope you found this information useful. My name's Cliff Stevenson. I'm the Helpful Economist. See you next time.